Robert Walpole was born on the 26th of August 1676 in Horton, Norfolk, born to a father of the same name, a man of the gentry class, a high-born and upper-class family. Walpole was one of 19 children. Being considered an excellent scholar after attending a private school and eventually Eton and King's College, Walpole left education after the death of his older brother Edward, so he could assist his father on the family estate, where he had become the new heir. This came after he was planning to become a clergyman. However, due to him now being the eldest surviving son, he abandoned the idea. His father's death in 1700 led Walpole to inherit the estate. In the same year, he married Catherine Shorter and had 2 daughters and 3 sons. While he was young, Walpole had bought shares in the South Sea Company, and even when it collapsed, Walpole came out a bit richer due to him buying at the bottom and selling at the top, adding to his ever-growing wealth. Walpole entered the government in 1701, a member of the Whig Party, after winning a seat in the election of that year, within the constituency of Castle Rising. Later the next year he would leave this seat to run for the King's Lynn Pocket Borough, constituencies subject to the informal but strong influence of patrons, a seat he was elected to and re-elected to for the remainder of his career. Around this time he was given the nickname of Robin by politicians and voters, which was later used as the name of his time of dominance between 1721 and 1742, the Robinocracy. In 1705, Walpole was appointed by Queen Anne to be a member of the council for her husband, Prince George of Denmark. Further into his time in politics, he became the intermediary for reconciling the Tory government to the Whig leaders. Lord Godolphin, leader of the cabinet and Lord High Treasurer, recognised his abilities and appointed him to the position of Secretary at War in 1708. In 1710, Walpole also held the position of Treasurer of the Navy, and his ascent in politics continued. However, even though Walpole was excelling within the chamber, he could not stop Godolphin and the Whigs from pressing for the prosecution of Henry Sacheverell, a minister who preached anti-Whig sermons. This decision was very unpopular with much of the country, leading to riots and followed by the downfall of the Whig Party in the election of 1710. The new ministry under the Tory party and Robert Harley removed Walpole from his position of Secretary at War, yet he remained in his other positions a little while longer until 1711. Harley attempted to both persuade Walpole and then threatened him to join his party. However, he rejected the offers. Walpole went on to become one of the most outspoken members of the Whig opposition, defending other members of the chamber against attacks from the Tories in debates as well as in the press. In 1712, Walpole was accused of venality and corruption and pronounced guilty of a high breach of trust and notorious corruption. This was due to his involvement in 2 forage contracts for Scotland and was impeached by the House of Commons and then found guilty by the House of Lords, even though he never kept any of the money from the supposed crime. After being imprisoned for 6 months in the Tower of London and his expulsion from Parliament, he was re-elected for the King's Lynn constituency in 1713. The next year, George I ascended to the throne after the death of Queen Anne. George distrusted the current power holders within the government, the Tories, due to his belief that they opposed his right to succeed to the throne. However, within this year, the Whigs ascended to power, with Walpole becoming a Privy Councillor and the paymaster of the forces. By the time of the election of 1715, the Whigs were firmly in power. However, they were not led by one figure, but by a Whig junto, a collective group of high-ranking Whigs who ran the country. Lord Halifax, who was the titular leader, died that year, even if, however, the cabinet was ran more so by Lord Townshend, Walpole's brother-in-law, and James Stanhope. Walpole was appointed chairman of a secret committee with the aim to investigate the actions of the previous Tory ministry, which led to the impeachment of Harley and Lord Bolingbroke suffering from an act of attainder. Walpole's rise continued by 1716, for he was appointed the roles of First Commissioner of the Treasury and also Chancellor of the Exchequer, alongside being a member of the Board of General Officers, a body formed to investigate the abuse of pay. Walpole was able to introduce the sinking fund, which reduced the national debt. This was both in part to his positions and the encouragement of advisers. However, Walpole often found himself alongside Townshend, fighting against Stanhope and Lord Sunderland when it came to pressing matters such as foreign policy, even if King George supported Stanhope and Sunderland and their side of the party. Walpole resigned from the cabinet in 1717 due to Townshend's dismissal from his position of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. This made Sunderland and Stanhope technically the head of the government. Soon after this, a bitter family dispute between the King and the Prince of Wales split the royal family. Walpole and others who opposed the government often met at Leicester House, the Prince of Wales's home, in order to form political plans. Around this time, Walpole also became an advisor and close friend of the prince's wife, Caroline, and in 1720 he improved his position by bringing about a reconciliation between the prince and the king. Walpole was a force to be reckoned with, especially in his opposition against the Peerage Bill, which would have limited the power of the ruling monarch to create new peerages. Due to his opposition, there was first a temporary abandonment of the bill, and then a complete rejection of it by the House of Commons. This led Sunderland and Stanhope to come to terms with their opponents, and Townshend and Walpole returned to prominent positions within the cabinet. However, with his accepting the position of paymaster, Walpole lost the favour of the Prince of Wales, who still harboured disdain for his father's government. And now finally, Walpole's reign as Prime Minister is often credited to have started in 1721. This was due to what is known as the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company and the British government had created a plan where the company would assume the national debt of the country in exchange for lucrative bonds, with the presumption the company would eventually see a large profit through international trade. Many in the country, including Walpole, invested heavily in the company. However, the company had started to collapse by the end of 1720. In 1721, a committee investigated the scandal, deducing corruption on the part of many of those in the cabinet, including Stanhope and Sunderland, the heads of the ministry. They didn't face imprisonment, however, due to the personal influence of Walpole. However, Sunderland resigned and Stanhope died that year. Due to Walpole saving these men from being punished, he gained the nickname of Screenmaster General, or simply the Screen. This left Walpole the most important and influential figure within the ministry. In April he was appointed the First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Leader of the House of Commons. His appointment to First Lord of the Treasury is where historians often date the start of his de facto tenure as Prime Minister. Townshend joined him at the top of the ministry, appointed as Secretary of State for the Northern Department, controlling Great Britain's foreign affairs. However, they had to contend with the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, Lord Carteret. Under the guidance of Walpole, Parliament attempted to deal with the financial crisis caused by the South Sea Bubble. They used the estates of the directors of the South Sea Company to relieve the suffering of the victims, alongside dividing the stock of the company between the Bank of England and the East India Company. The Whig Party and the King both came under attack, the whole affair damaging their credibility. However, Walpole was able to defend both in the Commons with his typical skillful oration. Within his first year as Prime Minister, Walpole faced the issue of the discovery of a plot formed by Francis Atterbury, a member of the Tory party, where it was planned that the royal family would be captured and King James III would be proclaimed king. This exposure caused the hopes of the Jacobites for rebellion to be crushed. Other Tory party members felt the effects, with Lord Bolingbroke fleeing to France to avoid punishment for his Jacobite sympathies. During the remainder of King George I's reign, Walpole continued to ascend, with the political power of the monarch gradually diminishing and that of his ministers gradually increasing. By 1724, the primary political rival of Walpole and Townshend in the cabinet, Lord Carteret, was dismissed from his post of Southern Secretary and appointed to the lesser position of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Here, Carteret used his power to secretly aid in the controversy over Woods's halfpence and supported Drapier's letters behind the scenes, causing harm to Walpole's power. However, Walpole recovered from these events by removing the patent. However, Irish sentiment was situated against the English control. Walpole's partner, Townshend, working with the king, helped keep Great Britain at peace, specifically by negotiating a treaty with France and Prussia in 1725. However, Walpole was not consulted and stated that Townshend was too precipitate in his actions. However, Great Britain, now free from Jacobite threats, from war and from financial crises, grew prosperous alongside Walpole, gaining the favour of George I. Walpole, in 1725, persuaded him to revive the knighthood of the Bath, and was himself invested with the order, and in 1726 was made a Knight of the Garter. This also earned him another nickname, Sir Bluestring. With the death of George I in 1727 and the succession of George II, Walpole's position was threatened. For a few days it seemed as if Walpole would be dismissed. However, on the advice of Queen Caroline, the king agreed to keep him in office, as well as Townshend, even if he disliked him. Over the following years, Walpole and Townshend continued to share power, but they clashed over British foreign affairs, such as policy regarding Austria. Gradually, Walpole became the clearly dominant partner in government. Townshend retired on the 15th of May 1730, ending the Walpole-Townshend ministry, and marking the beginning of the Walpole ministry. This date is sometimes given as the beginning of Walpole's unofficial tenure as Prime Minister. With Townshend gone, Walpole was able to conclude the Treaty of Vienna, creating the Anglo-Austrian alliance. Throughout his time as Prime Minister, Walpole had many opponents due to him being a polarizing figure. The most prominent opponents he had were in the Country Party, a party made of a coalition between Tories and disaffected Whigs, and was more of a movement rather than a party. Lord Bolingbroke, a political enemy since the days of Queen Anne, and William Pulteney, a prominent and efficient Whig statesman who felt snubbed when Walpole failed to include him in the cabinet, both were prominent adversaries. Both men ran a periodical called The Craftsman, where they relentlessly denounced Walpole's policies. Walpole was also extensively satirized and parodied, often compared to the criminal Jonathan Wild, as John Gay did in his farcical Beggar's Opera. Other enemies included Jonathan Swift, Henry Fielding, Alexander Pope, and of course Samuel Johnson. Walpole managed to secure the support of the people and the House of Commons with a policy of avoiding war. He used his influence to prevent George II from entering the War of the Polish Succession in 1733, due to it being a dispute between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. This allowed him to boast that there are 50,000 men slain in Europe this year and not one Englishman. By avoiding war, Walpole could lower taxes, and he reduced the national debt with a sinking fund, alongside by negotiating lower interest rates. He managed to reduce the land tax from 4 shillings in 1721 to 3 shillings in 1728, 2 shillings in 1731, and finally to 1 shilling in 1732. His long-term goal was to replace the land tax, which was paid by the local gentry, with excise and custom taxes, which were paid by merchants, and eventually by consumers. Walpole joked that the gentry resembled hogs, which squealed loudly whenever anyone laid hands on them, and in contrast the merchants were like sheep, and yielded their wool without complaint. However, this joke backfired in 1733 when he was defeated in a major battle to impose excise taxes on wine and tobacco. With the aim of reducing the threat of smuggling, the tax was to be collected not at ports but at warehouses. This new proposal turned out to be very unpopular and aroused the opposition of the nation's merchants, proving not to be the blind cattle Walpole thought. Walpole agreed to withdraw the bill before Parliament voted on it, but he dismissed the politicians who had dared to oppose it in the first place. This led to Walpole losing a considerable element of his own Whig party to the opposition. After the general elections of 1734, Walpole's supporters still formed a majority within the House of Commons, although they were less abundant and therefore less powerful than before. However, he maintained both his parliamentary supremacy and his popularity in his home county of Norfolk. This was aided by in May of 1734 when he presented a new silver mace to the city of Norwich bearing Walpole's own coat of arms and the arms of the city. Despite this and other great occasions, Walpole's broader popularity had started to wane. In 1736, an increase in the tax of gin inspired riots in London, and the even more serious Porteous riots broke out in Edinburgh after the king pardoned a captain of the guard, John Porteous, who had commanded his troops to open fire on a group of protesters. While these events diminished his overall popularity, they failed to shake his majority in Parliament. His domination over the House of Commons was highlighted by the ease with which he secured the rejection of Sir John Barnard's plan to reduce the interest on the national debt. Walpole was also able to persuade Parliament to pass the Licensing Act of 1737, under which London theatres were regulated, aiming to censor what was being said about the government, specifically criticism. The Act revealed a disdain for main literary figures who had attacked Walpole's governments in their works, and aimed to silence them. While the Country Party attacked him relentlessly, Walpole subsidised writers and lesser-known journalists such as William Arnold and Bishop Benjamin Hoadley, as well as 2 men he named to the role of Poet Laureate, Lawrence Eusden and Coley Cibber. They defended Walpole from the charge of evil political corruption, arguing that corruption is the universal human condition. They also argued that political divisiveness was also universal and inevitable because of selfish passions that were integral to human nature. Arnold specifically argued that government must be strong enough to control conflict, and in that regard Walpole was successful. This style of court political rhetoric continued throughout the 18th century. In 1737 his first wife died. However, he remarried the following year to his mistress, Maria Skerritt, who he'd been acquainted with prior to Catherine's death. Maria bore him a daughter, but eventually died of a miscarriage in 1739. Also, in 1737, Walpole's close friend Queen Caroline died, and though her death did not end his personal influence with George II, who had grown loyal to Walpole during the preceding years, Walpole's domination of government continued to decline. His opponents acquired a vocal leader in Frederick, the Prince of Wales, who was estranged from his father, the King. Several young politicians, including William Pitt the Elder and George Grenville, formed a faction known as the Patriot Boys and joined the Prince of Wales in opposition. Walpole's failure to maintain a policy of avoiding military conflict eventually led to his fall from power. Under the Treaty of Seville, Great Britain agreed not to trade with the Spanish colonies in North America. Spain claimed the right to board and search British vessels to ensure compliance with this provision. However, disputes broke out over trade with the West Indies, and Walpole attempted to prevent war but was opposed by the King, the House of Commons, and even a faction within his own cabinet. In 1739, Walpole abandoned all efforts to stop the conflict and commenced the War of Jenkins' Ear, lasting ultimately until 1748. Walpole's influence continued to dramatically decline even after the war began. The 1741 election saw his supporters secure an increase in votes in constituencies that were decided by mass electorates, but failed to win in many pocket boroughs. Overall, the government made gains in England and Wales, but this was not enough to overturn the reverses of the 1734 election, and further losses in Cornwall, where many constituencies were obedient to the will of the Prince of Wales, due to him also being the Duke of Cornwall. These constituencies returned members of Parliament hostile to the Prime Minister. Similarly, the influence of the Duke of Argyll, John Campbell, secured the election of members opposed to Walpole in some parts of Scotland. Walpole's new majority was difficult to determine because of the uncertain loyalties of many new members. In this new Parliament, many Whigs thought the ageing Prime Minister was incapable of leading the military campaign. Furthermore, his majority was not as strong as it had formerly been. His detractors were approximately as numerous as his supporters. Behind these political enemies were opposition Whigs, Tories and Jacobites. Walpole was alleged to have overseen an immense increase in corruption and to have enriched himself enormously whilst in office. Parliamentary committees were formed to investigate these charges. In 1742, when the House of Commons was prepared to determine the validity of a by-election in Chippenham, Walpole and others agreed to treat the issue as a motion of no confidence. Due to him being defeated on the vote, he agreed to resign from the government. The news of the naval disaster against Spain in the Battle of Cartagena de Indias also promoted the end of his political career. As part of this resignation, the King agreed to elevate him to the House of Lords as the Earl of Orford, Viscount Walpole, and Baron Walpole of Halton in the county of Norfolk, which occurred on the 6th of February 1742. 5 days later, he formally relinquished the seals of office. Although no longer First Lord of the Treasury, Walpole remained politically involved as an advisor and was especially useful as he still retained the King's favour. After resigning, his main political roles were to support the government by means of advice, to give out some patronage, and to speak on the ministry's behalf in the House of Lords. Walpole was succeeded as Prime Minister by Lord Wilmington in an administration whose true head was Lord Carteret. A committee was created to inquire into Walpole's ministry, but no substantial evidence of wrongdoing or corruption was ever discovered. Though he was no longer a member of the cabinet, he continued to maintain personal influence with George II, and was often dubbed the Minister Behind the Curtain for this advice and influence. In 1744, he managed to secure the dismissal of Carteret and the appointment of Henry Pelham, whom he regarded as a political protégé. He advised Pelham to make use of his seat in the Commons to serve as a bridge between the King and Parliament, just as Walpole had done. Walpole's last years saw him exercise his power within the House of Lords, and mainly enjoying his hobbies such as hunting, collecting art, and also dealing with estate matters. His health deteriorated rapidly towards the end of 1744, and he died the next year in London, at the age of 68.